The cold in Wallachia did not merely bite, it buried men where they stood. By December of 1476, the ground was so hard with frost that even the dead seemed to resist the earth. Vlad III rode at the front of a long column that stretched behind him like a funeral procession. 2,000 soldiers. He knew the faces of most of them, and, truthfully, he also knew the names of the relatives he had ordered killed. In Wallachia, a man could owe his prince loyalty or revenge, but really, those two things often looked exactly the same. The official chronicles claim he was riding south to confront an Ottoman raiding force reported near the border. That version is neat, comfortable, but the reality is darker than that. Vlad was not hunting anyone, he was being delivered, escorted into position by the very men sworn to defend him, guided step by step toward a killing ground disguised as a military operation. He was leading his own funeral escort, and he may have been the only man in that column who did not fully understand it yet. Less than a month later, inside a chamber lit by candlelight in Constantinople, a ceramic vessel sealed in dark wax was opened before the court of the Ottoman Sultan. Inside, packed in thick golden honey, was the severed head of the man Europe had come to fear as the Impaler. His eyes were still open, his mustache was still intact. The Sultan had paid well for that face. But the detail history tried hardest to swallow was this. The blade that took Vlad's head did not belong to a Turkish soldier. It belonged to someone who had once knelt before him, someone who had eaten at his table. The men who killed him were not foreign invaders. They were insiders, boyars, nobles, men from his own court. This was not a battlefield death. It was a contract killing dressed in chainmail, a medieval execution planned in private chambers and carried out beneath the cover of a winter campaign that never truly needed to happen. And when it was over, the conspirators could not simply leave the corpse and walk away. A murdered prince creates questions. Questions create inquiries. Inquiries create gallows. So they chose something far more calculated than concealment. They replaced the man with a myth. They buried the assassination beneath so many layers of folklore that, more than 5 centuries later, most people still do not realize what happened. They turned a political murder into a vampire story, and the world accepted it. This was never just a tale about Dracula. It was the reconstruction of a state-sponsored assassination, the betrayal that made it possible, and the last hours of a man who rode into the wilderness, ringed by traitors, and never rode back out. The design of that assassination was not born in a single room or a single winter. It had been engineered across decades by men whose survival depended on betraying at exactly the right moment. To understand how Vlad III was delivered to his killers, you first have to understand the organism that had been feeding on Wallachia long before he ever reached its throne. Forget the romantic image of noble lords ruling from candlelit halls. The Boyar Council of Wallachia did not operate like guardians of a kingdom. It operated like a syndicate, a cartel dressed in fur and silver crosses. These men functioned with the cold efficiency of a modern board of directors controlling a hostile territory trapped between two imperial powers. To the north stood the Kingdom of Hungary, a militarized Christian monarchy hungry for buffer states. To the south loomed the Ottoman Empire, an expanding Islamic war machine that had already swallowed Constantinople and kept grinding deeper into the Balkans with every passing decade. Wallachia sat directly between them, and the boyars had learned through generations of blood that the safest way to survive in a corridor of war was to sell themselves to whichever side happened to be winning. Their loyalty changed with the season. Their allegiance was purely transactional. When Hungary advanced south, the boyars raised Christian banners and swore loyalty to Rome. When the Ottomans pushed north, those same men bent themselves toward Mecca and promised tribute. Borders meant nothing to them. Sovereignty meant nothing to them. Commerce was all that mattered. Their fortunes were built on Danube trade routes, salt mines, and grain exports that kept moving no matter which empire claimed authority over the land. Princes came and went. The boyars remained. They were the permanent machinery of corruption, and every ruler who sat on the Wallachian throne learned sooner or later, through wisdom or through death, that the true power in the land was never the crown. It was the men standing behind it. Vlad III was supposed to understand that arrangement. When he first took power, the great boyar families expected a prince they could manage. A young ruler, shaped by years as a hostage at the Ottoman court, weakened by captivity, trained by fear, ready to sign whatever was placed in front of him while collecting a modest share of the profits. They expected an administrator. They received a storm. Vlad looked at the boyar council and did not see advisors. He saw a parasitic organism coiled around the throat of his country, draining its blood while selling its sovereignty to foreign courts for profit. He did not seek reform. He did not offer compromise. He moved toward total extermination. And for more than 500 years, history has misunderstood the logic behind that decision. The mass impalements that made his name infamous across Europe were not random outbursts of a deranged sadist. They were systematic liquidation. Every stake planted into the ground was a message. Every body raised above the Wallachian plains was a memorandum sent to every surviving boyar, every foreign diplomat, and every Ottoman commander within riding distance. The message was brutally clear. The old rules are finished. The middlemen are gone. This country answers to one voice now, and that voice does not negotiate. Consider the mechanics of the Easter Massacre of 1459. It remains one of the most surgically brutal purges in European history, and it was executed with the precision of a military operation. Vlad summoned the most powerful boyar families to his court at Targovishte under the cover of a religious feast. They arrived, draped in imported silks, accompanied by wives, eldest sons, and private retainers. They expected a banquet. They expected discussions over taxation rights and trade privileges. They passed through the gates of the citadel believing they were walking into a business meeting. Then the heavy oak doors closed behind them. Vlad's personal guard, chosen not from the nobility of Wallachia but from peasants and foreign mercenary ranks, moved into place around the courtyard. What followed was not a feast. It was an industrial purge. The elder boyars, the patriarchs of the most entrenched families, were dragged beyond the walls and impaled on greased wooden stakes. The technique was not crude. It was horrifyingly refined. The stakes were rounded at the tip, not sharpened, designed to push organs aside instead of puncturing them at once. That detail mattered. It kept the victim alive and conscious, while gravity slowly pulled the full weight of the body downward, tearing through tissue over hours, sometimes days. Their bodies were left above the road leading into Targovishte, visible to every merchant, every traveler, every envoy approaching the capital. The younger nobles, the sons and nephews who represented the next generation of boyar power, were spared immediate death. But that mercy was only another instrument of instruction. Vlad forced them 50 miles north into the Carpathian Mountains, still wearing torn feast garments, wrists bleeding where ropes had cut into them. They were ordered to build his fortress at Poenari. They hauled stones up near vertical cliffs until the skin split on their hands. When they collapsed, they were thrown from the heights. The fortress rose on their bones. This was not construction, it was a monument to the destruction of a ruling class. The boyars who escaped that purge never forgot it. They fled across borders into Hungary, into Moldavia, into Ottoman lands, carrying wealth, connections, and a hatred so deep it outlived the generation that first felt it. And from that day, they learned one lesson that mattered more than all others. Vlad could not be managed. He could not be bribed. He could not be reasoned with through the traditional language of aristocratic politics. He moved outside the system they had spent centuries building. He was an absolute in a world sustained by compromise and corruption. And for men whose entire existence depended on flexible loyalties, an absolute was the most dangerous thing alive. From that point onward, the surviving boyar network functioned around a single shared objective. Vlad had to be removed, not merely replaced, not merely exiled, destroyed entirely. But they had also learned, from the screams of their fathers hanging above the road into Targovishte, that a direct confrontation would be suicide. You do not charge a man who turns your intestines into public theater. You outmaneuver him. You use documents. You use signatures. You use ink. The first serious move against the impaler came not through steel, but through paper. In 1462, the surviving boyar faction made contact with King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Matthias was sharp, calculating, and thoroughly practical. He did not view Wallachia as a sovereign state in its own right. He viewed it as a piece on a larger board in his struggle with the Ottomans. The boyars placed before him a bundle of letters, supposedly written by Vlad, letters in which the prince appeared to offer betrayal of Christendom and a secret alliance with Sultan Mehmed II. The letters were forged. Carefully, meticulously, they mimicked Vlad's hand, his seal, his diplomatic language. It was an intelligence operation worthy of a modern service, a fabricated dossier meant to convert an inconvenient ally into a convenient prisoner. Matthias took the opportunity immediately. He arrested Vlad on the road, confiscated his military resources, and locked him away in the royal complex at Visegrad. The boyars rejoiced. The obstacle had been removed without the drawing of a single sword. Commerce could resume. Danube trade routes reopened. Tribute payments flowed south once more. Wallachia returned to what the boyars believed was its natural state, a marketplace disguised as a country, managed by men who measured patriotism in profit. For 14 years, Vlad III remained at Visegrad, and here the story enters a territory most historians skim over, because the psychological dimension of that captivity matters even more than the political one. Vlad was not thrown into a dungeon. He was not starved. He was not beaten. Matthias was too sophisticated for that kind of crude cruelty. Instead, he gave Vlad a comfortable residence, a royal stipend, books, eventually even a wife from the Hungarian nobility. He was allowed to walk the grounds. Outwardly, he was treated almost like a guest. For a man like Vlad, that was the cruelest punishment possible. He was forced to live in comfort while his country was torn apart. Reports kept reaching him. Ottoman raiding parties crossing the Danube unchecked. Villages in Wallachia burned. The same boyars who had betrayed him sitting in his throne room, wearing his crown, eating from his table, signing away the sovereignty of his country, one agreement at a time. He could see everything. He could change nothing. He was a predator behind glass, watching the world continue without him. Accounts from his Hungarian captors describe a man who never truly surrendered to that cage. In his quarters, he caught birds and mice and impaled them on tiny splinters of wood. Small bodies lined up in rows on a windowsill. This is usually presented as madness, but really, it reads more like maintenance. He was keeping his hands calibrated, keeping reflexes alive, preserving the internal architecture of the executioner. Because somewhere inside him there was still complete certainty that the cage would open one day. Geopolitics guaranteed it. Hungary would need him again. Not immediately, not next week. But eventually the balance would shift, and a manageable puppet would no longer be enough. When that moment came, they would need the monster. That moment arrived in 1476. The Ottoman Empire, now fully driven by the expansion of Mehmed the Conqueror, was pressing against the Hungarian frontier with an intensity Matthias could no longer absorb through diplomacy alone. His compliant, boyar-backed regimes in Wallachia were failing under pressure. The puppet princes he had tolerated were negotiators, not war leaders, administrators, traders dressed in royal garments, men who could manage grain shipments and stamp trade agreements, but who could not hold a line against an Ottoman siege force. They broke at the first sight of Turkish banners. Matthias needed something else now, something harsher, something feared. He needed violence guided by intelligence. He needed a weapon the Ottomans genuinely respected. So he went to Visegrad. He opened the door. He handed Vlad a sword and pointed him south. But Vlad's return to Wallachia was not a liberation, it was a delivery. He rode back into Targovist at the head of a Hungarian military escort, looking down from horseback at the men who had arranged his imprisonment years earlier. The same families, the same bloodlines, the sons and nephews and cousins of the men he had impaled 17 years before now knelt in frozen mud, pressed their lips to his ring, and swore undying loyalty to his restored crown. Every word was false. Every man present knew it. The Boyars kissed his ring with one hand and sent messages south with the other. Vlad understood that with the clinical calm of a man who had spent 14 years studying the bars of his cage, he had no illusions about loyalty, no illusions about survival. The arithmetic before him was brutally simple. He wore the crown, but he had no real army of his own. The forces around him were a patchwork of borrowed and hostile elements. Hungarian mercenaries who fought only for payment and whose contracts could be bought away by anyone richer. Wallachian conscripts commanded by boyar captains whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their financial interests. Every officer in camp, every cavalry leader, every supply master had a price, and the Ottomans were ready to pay, because Mehmed the Conqueror was not merely a battlefield enemy. He ruled the most sophisticated economic and logistical empire on earth. He understood something many commanders never do. Wars are won not only in fields and forests, but in ledgers. The offer extended to the Wallachian boyars was elegant and irresistible. Guarantee uninterrupted passage for Ottoman supply convoys through the Danube corridor. Ensure that Wallachia remains a cooperative transit zone rather than a hostile frontier. In return, your estates remain protected, your commercial networks expand, your private fortunes grow beneath Ottoman infrastructure. It was not framed as a military threat, it was a business proposal. For men who had spent their lives measuring value in gold rather than glory, that proposal was irresistible. Vlad represented total disruption to that arrangement. His philosophy of rule rested on absolute sovereignty, zero compromise, and the physical destruction of anyone who tried to subordinate Wallachian independence to foreign economic interests. He refused tribute. He burned Ottoman supply depots. He impaled Turkish envoys and displayed their bodies on the frontier as warnings. Every stake he planted cost the boyars money. Every raid he launched across the Danube disrupted trade routes the great families had spent decades building. The Ottomans did not need to send 100,000 soldiers into Wallachia to solve that problem. They only needed to finance an internal solution. They provided the gold. The boyars provided access. It was contract killing financed by an empire and executed by a boardroom. There was, however, one barrier between the conspirators and their target: 200 Moldavian soldiers. These men had been sent by Stephen the Great, Prince of Moldavia, and Vlad's cousin. Stephen was one of the sharpest military minds in Eastern Europe, and he was not naive. He knew exactly what kind of nest Vlad was walking back into. He did not send ceremonial guards or inexperienced boys. He sent hardened veterans, men who had fought Ottoman incursions for years along the Moldavian frontier, men who understood forests, night fighting, close-quarter violence. These 200 soldiers were the only men in Vlad's camp who did not answer to a boyar paymaster. They formed a protective ring around him at all times. They slept in shifts around his tent. They tested his meals for poison. They stood at the entrance of his pavilion with heavy poleaxes, wearing reinforced lamellar armor, layered with iron plates strong enough to turn aside a broadsword strike. For a brief time, this living wall kept assassination at bay. Then came the order that set the last act in motion. In late November, intelligence reached the camp that an Ottoman force had been seen near the fortress of Giurgiu, along the frozen southern bank of the Danube. Vlad ordered the army to march south and engage it. Whether that Ottoman force truly existed, or whether it was fabricated intelligence planted by the boyars to draw him from his secure position, remains debated by historians. But the result is not debated at all. The march south was the trigger the conspirators had been waiting for. A medieval army moving in winter is a grinding, miserable beast. The temperature fell below freezing and stayed there. The roads, primitive even in good weather, had been hardened by weeks of frost into jagged ridges of frozen mud that cracked beneath supply wagons and snapped the ankles of baggage horses. Men marched with heads lowered against a wind that cut through wool and leather as if neither existed. The sound was endless. Thousands of chainmail hauberks scraping against one another, iron-rimmed wheels screaming over frozen ground, horses breathing clouds of white vapor into the air. In that wall of noise, a man could be stabbed behind a wagon, and no one 10 paces away would hear the blade go in. The cold itself became a weapon. Chainmail does not insulate. It absorbs the temperature around it and transfers that cold straight into the body. The iron rings became conductors, dragging heat out of muscle and bone, numbing hands, stiffening arms. To even hold a sword required thick leather gauntlets, and those gauntlets destroyed fine control. Every hour on that road degraded the fighting capacity of the men protecting Vlad. The Moldavians were elite, yes, but they were still flesh, still blood, and the winter was steadily dismantling their ability to respond. The boyars understood that. They did not rush. They allowed the cold to begin the killing for them. Vlad rode at the front and felt the trap closing with every mile. A commander of his experience could read the signs the way a sailor reads the sea before a storm. Orders were being acknowledged just a fraction too slowly. Wallachian cavalry units drifted wider on the flanks than any proper formation required, opening meaningless gaps. Boyar captains adjusted the spacing of their forces with quiet precision, moving their men away from the Moldavian corps guard like chess pieces taking their final positions. They were isolating him, cutting the Moldavians away from the rest of the army, the way wolves separate one animal from the herd. So why did he keep riding? Because every other option was worse. To turn back toward the capital meant enduring siege conditions without enough provisions, trapped inside walls surrounded by enemies on both sides. To retreat into Hungary meant surrendering himself once more to the cage at Visegrad. And during those 14 years he had sworn in silence that he would die standing before he ever lived on his knees again. The only direction that offered even the smallest possibility was forward. If he could reach the Ottoman lines and force a violent, chaotic engagement, the disorder of battle might ruin the conspiracy. In that confusion, his own lethality and the discipline of his Moldavian bodyguard might still matter. He was placing everything on one desperate charge into uncertainty. It was not a real strategy anymore. It was the final choice of a man who had already accepted death and was now deciding only the manner of it. Ahead of them rose the forest of Vlasia like a wall, dense, ancient woodland, tangled with undergrowth, and crossed by narrow paths that stretched the army into a thin, vulnerable line. It was the worst ground imaginable for a force trying to preserve cohesion. Visibility collapsed. The canopy blocked what little winter sun remained and plunged the trail into a permanent gray half-light, where shapes dissolved 20 yards away. The ground was uneven, gripped by roots and frozen brush that snagged boots and horses alike. For an army trying to hold formation, it was a nightmare. For men planning an ambush, it was perfect. The Wallachian vanguard, commanded entirely by boyar officers, began accelerating ahead without waiting for proper orders. They pulled away from the center and disappeared into the trees. At the same time, the Hungarian mercenaries at the rear slowed their wagons nearly to a stop, allowing the distance between themselves and the Moldavian guard to widen minute by minute. It was coordinated, precise. Within the span of an hour, the column had fractured into 3 separate sections, and the middle section, Vlad and his 200 Moldavians, had been completely isolated in the heart of the forest, with no clear sightline to either vanguard or rearguard. Swallowed by timber, swallowed by silence. In a moment like that, when geometry fails and numbers turn against you, the only thing standing between a man and annihilation is the loyalty of the soldiers closest to him. Vlad looked at his Moldavians and saw men who understood exactly what was happening. They were not confused. They were not panicked. They tightened their grip on their poleaxes. They closed ranks around his horse. They formed a skiltron, a dense moving wall of iron and wood, and fixed their eyes on the tree line. They knew the boyars had been bought. They knew the Hungarians would not return. They knew they were going to die in that forest. And they stood anyway. That kind of loyalty cannot be purchased with gold. It is not manufactured by slogans. It is forged in shared hardship and sealed by something stronger than calculation. Then the column stopped. The forward scouts had not returned. In the stillness of the Vlasia forest, the only sounds left were the strained breathing of horses and the slow creak of frozen leather saddles shifting under armored bodies. Vlad raised his hand. The Moldavian captain answered at once, issuing sharp commands in a low voice that carried only as far as it needed. The schiltron tightened, shields locked, poleaxes angled outward, turning the ring into a wall of steel aimed toward the dark woods on every side. Vlad drew his sword. The blade left the scabbard with a clean, metallic note that split the silence like thunder cracking through an empty cathedral. The steel caught the last gray light filtering through the canopy and held it for a moment. A thin line of cold fire suspended in darkness. But he did not turn toward the supposed Ottoman threat that had lured them here. He turned his horse slowly, deliberately, and faced the rear. He stared into the shadows of his own column, into the forest where his own soldiers had vanished, into the darkness that had swallowed the men who had knelt before him, kissed his ring, and sworn themselves faithful. Then the horn sounded. Not the deep rolling blast of an Ottoman war horn, not the brass signal of a Hungarian cavalry charge. It was the high, sharp, unmistakable note of a Wallachian hunting horn, the sound used when prey has been cornered and the kill can begin. The tree line erupted. Arrows came first. Not from a distant line, not from some hidden ridge. They were fired at close range from both flanks at the same instant, flying flat and hard through the freezing air, built for penetration rather than arc. Then the Wallachian cavalry burst from the underbrush on both sides of the trail. Horses smashed through frozen brush. Riders came on without shouting, without battle cries, without any of the noise men usually use to dress murder up as glory. They moved in silence, with the cold efficiency of men carrying out a contract, swords already drawn, lances leveled, eyes fixed on the dense knot of Moldavian guards surrounding the man in the center. The killing in the snow had begun. History is almost never written by the men who endure an event. It is manufactured by the men who survive it and control the parchment afterward. And for more than 5 centuries, the accepted story of how Vlad III died rested on the words of a man whose livelihood depended on ensuring the truth never surfaced. The principal source that shaped what the Western world came to believe about the Impaler's last moments was Antonio Bonfini, a court chronicler employed directly by King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Bonfini was not an independent investigator. He was not some neutral scholar chasing truth through Eastern archives. He was a salaried architect of narrative, hired to make his master appear wise, blameless, and justified before history. Every sentence he committed to parchment passed first through the filter of political usefulness, and the story he built around Vlad's death was one of the cleanest pieces of medieval disinformation ever produced. According to Bonfini, the death was an accident, a tragic mistake in the chaos of battle. His version goes like this. Vlad, eager to watch the progress of a clash with an Ottoman patrol near the southern frontier, rode up to the crest of a low hill to survey the fighting. In the confusion, his own vanguard, unable to distinguish his silhouette from that of a Turkish officer at distance, drove a lance through his chest. Friendly fire, a battlefield misfortune, no conspiracy, no betrayal, just the fog of war consuming a reckless prince who had strayed too close to the action. It is tidy, it is easy to repeat, and it falls apart the moment anyone subjects it to serious scrutiny. Start with the basic logistics of the alleged Ottoman threat. A foreign military force, operating in Wallachia in late December of 1476, would have faced conditions so punishing that sustained field operations become nearly impossible. An army large enough to pose a serious tactical threat requires enormous support merely to remain alive in winter. Thousands of pounds of grain and dried fodder every day to keep cavalry horses from collapsing. Large fire pits each night to prevent infantry from freezing in their sleep. Supply wagons, medical stores, foraging detachments, scouts. You do not move that apparatus through the frozen woodlands of southern Wallachia without leaving a trail visible to every village watcher, every border militia, every mounted patrol for miles. The idea that a meaningful Ottoman strike force appeared silently near Giurgiu, engaged the Wallachian prince, killed him by accident, and then simply vanished back across the Danube without sustained pursuit or follow-up action is not just unlikely, it is operationally absurd. Then consider the defensive structure surrounding Vlad at the time of his supposed accidental death. He was encircled constantly by 200 elite Moldavian bodyguards. These were not ceremonial attendants with polished weapons. They were professional soldiers sent by Stephen the Great, one of the most capable commanders in 15th century Europe. Their single purpose was the physical protection of Vlad's person. They kept a ring around him during marches, in camp, and in battle. The idea that some random Turkish detachment punched through that ring, struck the prince, and withdrew without triggering a sustained reaction from 200 veterans whose entire mission was to stop exactly that from happening does not survive contact with reality. The Moldavians did not fail because an outside enemy somehow reached Vlad. They were overwhelmed because the enemy was already inside the formation. The truth is that the boyars had been preparing this outcome for months. The operational plan was patient, exact, and built on financial incentives strong enough to make cooperation among the conspirators almost inevitable. They already had a replacement prince selected, approved, and waiting. His name was Basarab Laiota. He came from the rival Doneshti branch of the Wallachian ruling line, a man with no dangerous commitment to sovereignty or independence. Laiota understood what the boyars required: a prince who would sign Ottoman trade agreements, a prince who would reopen the Danube transit corridors, a prince who would accept a comfortable share and never ask where the greater profits flowed. He was the perfect instrument, a rubber stamp wearing royal robes. But installing Laiota required a vacancy on the throne, and that vacancy had to be created under conditions where the conspirators could control every layer of the story that followed. The killing could not happen in Targovishte. The capital had too many variables: urban militias, loyalist pockets among lower nobles and merchants who had benefited from Vlad's economic order, palace servants, guards, witnesses. A murder in the city risked testimony, resistance, and unrest. It had to happen somewhere isolated, somewhere the only men present were men already on the payroll. It had to happen in the wilderness. The march south toward the reported Ottoman force near Giurgiu provided precisely that. Whether that Ottoman sighting had been real or fabricated specifically to pull Vlad from fortified ground remains a matter historians still argue over. But the result is beyond argument. The march drew him away from the walls of the capital, away from any possible intervention by loyalists, and delivered him into the geographic isolation of the Vlasia forest, surrounded by men who had already agreed to kill him. The attack itself was designed as organized chaos. When the Wallachian forces turned inward against the Moldavian Guard, they did not launch a conventional cavalry charge. The ancient timber of the Vlasia forest made that impossible. The trees stood too close. The undergrowth was too dense. A horse trying to gallop at full speed there would break its legs on roots in moments. Instead, the boyar cavalry dismounted along the tree line and advanced on foot in coordinated clusters, moving through the timber from multiple directions at once, tightening the net around the stranded Moldavian circle. They used the environment itself as a weapon. Narrow paths, limited sight, the suffocating closeness of the woods that transformed a defensive ring into a cage. The temperature was devastating, far below freezing, cold enough to transform the physical capacity of every man in that clearing. Snow lay a foot deep in places, crusted at the top by repeated freeze-thaw cycles, but soft and treacherous below, concealing roots, rocks, fallen limbs, and the frozen ruts of old animal tracks that could snap an ankle or trap a boot at the worst possible second. Moving through that snow in full armor was exhausting. Fighting in it was worse. Every step demanded effort. Every swing had to account for unstable ground. Modern audiences almost always underestimate what extreme cold does to a human body under combat conditions. A chainmail hauberk is made from thousands of interlocking iron rings. Iron is a conductor of heat. In sub-zero weather, it does not merely fail to protect the body. It actively drains warmth from it, pulling heat through the padded garment beneath and sending it into the frozen air. The men in that forest were already entering the early stages of hypothermia before the first real blow landed. Their muscles were slower, reaction times degraded, fingers trapped inside thick, boiled leather gauntlets meant to prevent frostbite, had lost the fine control needed for quick weapon changes or grip adjustments in close fighting. The cold was not just scenery. It was a strategic factor the Boyars had counted on from the start. Every hour on the road had reduced the defensive ability of the Moldavian Guard. Every drop in temperature shifted the balance a little farther toward the attackers, because the attackers knew when the violence would begin. They could conserve themselves. The defenders could not. When the hunting horn ripped through the silence, adrenaline hit both sides at once, but not in the same way. The Moldavians experienced the full shock of ambush. Heart rates surged, blood rushed from core to limbs. Muscles flooded with oxygen and glucose in a burst the body can only sustain briefly. Peak combat output under full adrenaline lasts perhaps 90 seconds to 3 minutes before lactic acid begins to flood the muscles, turning arms heavy and lungs into furnaces. The attackers, who had waited in place for minutes or perhaps hours before the signal, entered at a controlled pace. They had chosen the moment. In medieval combat, the side that chooses the moment usually wins. The first impact was not cinematic. It was a collision of steel, bodies, and geometry. The Boyar mercenaries carried weapons chosen for exactly this kind of terrain. Short arming swords, flanged maces, war hammers with reinforced steel heads designed to focus force into narrow surfaces capable of denting armor and breaking the skull underneath it. These were tools of cramped murder, designed for forest fighting, where a long weapon can become a burden if the enemy closes quickly. But the Moldavians were not ordinary foot soldiers. They had trained with poleaxes in conditions like these. A 15th century poleaxe was a terrifying instrument, a shaft of dense ash wood topped by a complex steel head combining a spear point for thrusting, an axe blade for cutting and hooking, and a hammer face for crushing armored plate. In the hands of a trained veteran, it could cave in a helmet, break a collarbone, or punch through a breastplate from a distance that kept its wielder outside the reach of shorter weapons. When the first wave hit the perimeter, the Moldavians answered with controlled lateral sweeps that turned the clearing into a slaughter zone. The sound of an iron hammer face striking a steel helmet is not the ringing clash of stage combat. It is flat, wet, concussive, more like a ceramic vessel breaking against stone than any heroic sound from legend. Men dropped where they stood, skulls split or brains hemorrhaging beneath dented metal. The snow around the Moldavian ring darkened in seconds. Bodies collapsed at the base of the defensive line, forcing the next attackers to climb over them, trip on them, or shove them aside before they could reach striking distance. The Moldavians fought in silence. No chants, no cries, no speeches. They operated with the mechanical discipline of men who had already accepted the arithmetic of their situation and chosen to make the remaining minutes of their lives cost the enemy as dearly as possible. But courage does not defeat mathematics forever. The attackers kept coming. The Boyars had committed enough men to absorb the initial casualties and maintain pressure on every side of the shrinking ring. In a packed infantry melee, the reality is not elegant duels between worthy adversaries. It is suffocation. Bodies pressed chest to chest, shoulder to shoulder. The smell of sweat, wet wool, blood, and hot breath. A dagger tip probing for the gap between helmet and gorget. Steel scraping steel. Grunts, thick sounds of metal entering flesh. Screams crushed by the press of bodies around them. And footing becomes everything. Footing was the first thing the Moldavians began to lose. The snow beneath them had been churned into a red slurry of blood, half-melted ice, and dirt. Iron-shod boots found no grip on that surface. Men slipped. And in a dense melee, a man who falls does not rise again. He is trampled by both sides, crushed under bodies, stabbed by men who cannot even see what they are hitting beneath the press below knee level. One by one, the Moldavians fell. A flanged mace shattered a shoulder, taking away the arm that held the poleaxe. A thrust found the weak point at the armpit, where armor plates did not fully overlap. A warhammer smashed into a knee from the side, collapsing the joint and dropping the defender into the churned snow where daggers finished what the hammer began. With every body lost, the perimeter tightened. The circle around Vlad contracted and buckled under the sheer pressure of bodies forcing inward from every direction. The attackers were not trying to win through skill alone. They were using volume, throwing mass against the ring until its structure failed from cumulative damage and exhaustion. Vlad stood in the center of that collapsing circle. He had fought in wars across 3 decades. He understood the physiology of prolonged combat with the precision of a man who had watched thousands die. He knew that the burn in his guard's arms meant lactic acid had fully taken hold. He knew that the slowing of their strikes meant energy reserves were nearly spent. He knew that the gaps opening in the formation were not tactical choices. They were symptoms, signs of a structure failing in real time. And then there was the final confirmation. The shields, striking the Moldavian line, bore the heraldic signs of his own Wallachian units. The armor of the men attacking him carried the insignia of officers from his own court. This was not an Ottoman ambush discovered by chance. It was an internal execution, coordinated and deliberate, carried out by men who had sworn loyalty to him less than 2 months earlier. The end came the way such endings usually do, not in a noble duel between prince and rival, not on a hilltop beneath the sky, not with a speech. It came in mud and blood, the fragmentary forensic evidence that survives after more than 5 centuries of deliberate confusion points toward a close-quarters kill. As the Moldavian ring finally buckled and the attackers breached the inner space, someone reached Vlad. The blow was not theatrical. It was efficient. A blade driven through one of the structural weaknesses that exist in every suit of armor, no matter how fine. The armpit, the groin, the back of the neck where helmet meets gorget, an upward thrust, angled to slip past the plates and enter soft tissue below. The strike severed major vessels. Blood loss would have been immediate and catastrophic. Vlad fell into the red snow. The man who had ordered the impalement of tens of thousands, the man whose name had made empires recoil, died not beneath the sword of a foreign conqueror but in an unmarked forest clearing, choking on his own blood at the hands of his own court. The biology of death from arterial hemorrhage on a frozen battlefield is brutally exact. The moment the major vessels were opened, Vlad would have entered hypovolemic shock, blood pressure dropping, heart racing, then beginning to fail as circulation collapsed. The frozen ground beneath him drawing heat from his body even faster as he bled out. Vision narrowing to a tunnel as the brain, deprived of oxygen, began shutting down peripheral function. The sounds around him, boots in snow, splintering wood, men dying in low guttural bursts, would have dissolved into a distant hum. He did not deliver some final immortal sentence. He did not offer history a dramatic last line. He bled into dirt like every other soldier history later chose to remember incorrectly. The killing stopped the moment the target was confirmed dead. The surviving attackers stepped back from the carnage, breathing hard into the freezing air, white vapor rising from open mouths, weapons dripping. The remaining Moldavians were executed where they stood or where they lay, every one of them. The Boyars could not allow witnesses. Not a single man from that 200-strong guard could be permitted to survive and carry word of what had actually happened in the forest to Stephen the Great, or to any foreign court that might use the truth as a weapon. Wounded soldiers were speared through the chest. Men dragging themselves toward the brush were hauled back by their ankles and had their throats opened. The elimination of witnesses was just as systematic as the assassination itself. When the last Moldavian stopped moving, the forest fell into a silence so complete that the only sound left was wind moving through bare branches above the dead. Then the operational phase began. The Boyars had not come merely to kill a prince, they had come to collect delivery on a contract. Mehmed the Conqueror had placed a bounty on Vlad's head, not metaphorically, literally. He wanted the physical head delivered to Constantinople as proof. The Sultan had personal reasons for it. The night attack of 1462, when Vlad had penetrated the Ottoman camp with a strike force and nearly killed Mehmed in his own tent, had become an enduring humiliation. This was not only a geopolitical transaction, it was vengeance funded by imperial treasury. Decapitation with a battlefield weapon is not the clean, instant act films have taught people to imagine. A sword is built to slice flesh and muscle. It is not built to pass neatly through vertebrae, tendons, and the dense structures protecting the spinal column at the base of the skull. The man assigned to the task had to kneel beside the corpse in blood-soaked snow. He seized Vlad by the hair, yanked the head backward to stretch open the throat, and drove a heavy blade down into the neck. The first strike cut the windpipe and severed the carotid arteries. Warm blood spilled over his gauntlets and into the snow. The blade struck the cervical spine and stopped. Then came the brutal work. He wrenched the edge sideways, using leverage and body weight to force steel through cartilage and ligament. The tissue resisted. He twisted. He sawed. The final separation of the spinal cord produced a sound that carried through the clearing. Then he lifted the head by the matted hair, while blood drained from the open neck stump in slow, thick pulses. What happened next reveals how deeply planned the entire operation really was. The assassins had brought a large ceramic vessel into the forest. Not a water jar, not a common field container. A specially prepared preservation vessel, sealed with heavy wax, intended for one purpose only. Inside it was thick golden honey. In the 15th century, honey was one of the most effective biological preservatives available. It has antimicrobial properties. Its low moisture and high sugar content create an environment hostile to the bacteria that drive decomposition. If submerged in honey, organic tissue can remain intact for weeks, even months. The conspirators knew the head had to survive a journey of roughly 300 miles south to Constantinople. They knew the Sultan required a recognizable trophy. The features needed to remain visible. A rotten mass would not satisfy the bargain. But honey in sub-zero weather is nearly solid. It does not flow. It sits in the jar like thick amber stone. So to use it, they had to build a fire there in the clearing. Think about that scene carefully. A group of men standing in a winter forest, littered with more than 200 dead soldiers, gathering wood, lighting a fire, and waiting for a jar of honey to soften so they could preserve the severed head of their prince for shipment. They warmed their hands above the flames. They stamped their boots against the cold. They may even have eaten from their rations while they waited. And, really, that calm is more disturbing than the violence. Violence can still be blamed on fear or adrenaline. But warming honey beside a mutilated corpse requires another kind of mind altogether. It requires rehearsal, agreement, premeditation, long before the first strike was delivered. When the honey finally softened to the correct consistency, they lowered Vlad's head into the vessel. The thick liquid displaced the remaining air, filling the open mouth, coating the nostrils, covering the still open eyes. They pressed it downward until it was fully submerged. Then they sealed the lid with hot wax to create an airtight barrier that would preserve the contents during the long road south. The Sultan had commissioned a product. The cartel delivered it exactly as ordered, and the mere presence of that jar in the forest destroys any last illusion that the death had been accidental or spontaneous. No one carries a heavy, fragile ceramic vessel filled with expensive preservation medium on a routine winter patrol. No one brings specialized packaging to a skirmish with a rumored raiding party. You bring such things only to a prearranged execution where the schedule, location, and required deliverable were established in advance. The honey jar is the smoking gun of the conspiracy. It proves that every element, from the intelligence about Georgiou to the engineered fragmentation of the army column to the assault on the Moldavian ring, had been planned and resourced before the march even began. Once the trophy was secured, the boyars turned to the administrative work of their coup. They stripped the dead of everything valuable: Vlad's armor, his weapons, his signet rings, the royal seal. The quality steel and hardened leather worn by Moldavian captains was taken from cooling bodies and distributed among boyar officers as spoils. In the medieval economy, fine armor was wealth. A reinforced lamellar suit could be worth more than a common soldier earned in an entire year. The dead were harvested with the efficiency of accountants working through an inventory list. Before the bodies in the clearing had even finished cooling, a mounted messenger was already riding north toward the Hungarian court. He carried a written report for King Matthias Corvinus. The report stated that Prince Vlad III had fallen during a surprise engagement with an Ottoman raiding party near the southern border. Killed in action. A heroic death while defending the Christian frontier of the Danube. The lie was written down and sealed with official marks before the blood in the forest had frozen hard. Matthias would receive it within days, and Matthias, who had every reason to want Vlad permanently removed from the political board, accepted it without real investigation. The fiction was convenient for everyone involved. Basarab Lyoto was proclaimed Prince of Wallachia before the week ended. He entered Targovishte under boyar escort, sat upon the throne Vlad had reclaimed barely 2 months earlier, and at once began signing the tribute arrangements and trade agreements. Vlad had spent his reign resisting. Ottoman supply convoys crossed the Danube without obstruction. Tax revenues flowed south toward Constantinople. Boyar estates were confirmed, protected, and expanded. The commercial machine Vlad had disrupted roared back to life in a matter of weeks. The restructuring was complete. The disruptive ruler had been removed and replaced with a compliant executive who understood that his role was to sign, approve, and collect his share. Then the sealed jar began its journey south toward Constantinople. The boyars mounted up, formed their columns, and rode back toward the capital to begin governing under their obedient prince. The forest of Vlasia settled once more into winter silence. Fresh snow began to fall within hours, layering white over churned red mud, shattered Polyak shafts, and the broken bodies of the 200 Moldavian soldiers who had died keeping a promise they knew would cost them everything. But the conspirators had left a problem behind, a flaw in the architecture of their perfect crime. They had taken the head because they needed it. The Sultan demanded it, but the body remained. The body of Vlad III lay headless in that forest clearing, and a dead prince was one of the most dangerous objects in the medieval political world. Leave it for wolves, and a loyal patrol might later find the bones and turn the site into a martyr's shrine. Bury it in some unmarked patch of ground, and the grave could still be discovered, the remains identified, the physical truth of assassination reconstructed from what was left behind. Display it publicly, and the conspirators would be admitting regicide. Every option carried risk. Every option left a trace. So the body vanished. When the snow melted and spring returned to the Vlasia forest, the clearing was empty. No grave, no remains, no marker. The headless corpse of one of the most feared rulers in Europe had simply ceased to exist. And where the boyars hid the body of the impaler became a question that consumed historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for more than 5 centuries. Because a headless corpse weighing close to 200 pounds does not evaporate. It does not melt into the soil. It does not disappear just because the men who created it need silence to hold. When the boyar commanders rode out of the Vlasia forest carrying their sealed jar and blood-stained silver, they left behind a problem that no amount of Ottoman gold could solve by itself. The corpse of a sovereign, even desecrated, carries a political gravity that outlives flesh. A dead prince is not merely a body, it is a symbol. In the wrong hands, it becomes a relic, a rallying cry, a center around which scattered loyalty can gather again and turn into the one thing the conspirators could not afford: rebellion. The boyars understood that with the same cold transactional clarity they brought to every other part of their operation. The peasants of Wallachia, the same people who had suffered beneath Vlad's regime of terror, had also been among the main beneficiaries of his policies. He had broken merchant cartels that manipulated grain prices. He had executed tax collectors who skimmed money meant for the villages. He had, in his violent and absolute way, imposed a version of order on a land that had known generations of exploitation under boyar rule. The common people feared him, but they also understood that under his reign, for the first time in living memory, the powerful suffered consequences for corruption. If those people found his body, they would not necessarily see only a tyrant, they might see a martyr. And in the medieval world, martyrs create shrines. Shrines create pilgrimages. Pilgrimages create communities. Communities create armies. The body had to disappear, completely, permanently, without leaving a trace that could be found, honored, or raised into legend against the men who had ordered the killing. That task fell to a small detachment of mercenaries chosen precisely because they were discreet and spiritually indifferent. These were not men who would tremble at the threshold of a church. They remained in the frozen clearing after the main boyar column departed, working in the dim gray light before dawn with the emotionless pace of hired hands finishing a contract. They brought a wooden cart, not a military wagon, a livestock cart, the kind a butcher might use to haul slaughtered animals from killing floor to market. The symbolism may have been accidental, it may have been deliberate. With the boyars, those two things often blurred into each other. They stripped what remained of armor and clothing from the corpse, reducing the Prince of Wallachia to bare, stiffening flesh. The cold had already begun hardening the muscle. Rigor mortis in sub-zero conditions can set quickly and lock the limbs into the positions held at the moment of death. The body had become rigid, angular, resistant to movement. The mercenaries had to force it onto the cart, bending frozen joints by brute leverage, folding the frame of one of the most feared men in Europe over rough wooden slats like butchered meat. Then they threw heavy canvas over the load, lashed it down with rope, and turned the cart north, not toward the main roads, not toward the trade corridors where witnesses might notice the cargo. They drove deeper into the desolate, frozen marshland north of the Vlassia forest. Their destination had been chosen for isolation, silence, and sacred authority.